Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and sending each and every one of you so much love. And don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa because you need to keep lovely and warm on those cozy nights. And I've got the most amazing story for you. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. My name is Matt, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2004 when I was 10 years old at the time, when my family moved to a beautiful wooden cabin on a few acres of land that borders the San Juan National Forest in Colorado. My mother moved us out to this part of the world as a result of receiving a hefty life insurance policy after my dad was killed on a violent police raid as part of a SWAT team trying to arrest some notoriously duplicitous drug dealers whom had been dealing with large amounts of cocaine and other illegal narcotics. The raid on this drug lord's home had been planned long in advance, with fastidious attention to detail, and there had been ongoing spying on the dealers in question for a considerable period of time to determine their daily movements. One policeman had actually gone undercover to buy a sizable amount of drugs in order to acquire as much information and knowledge as he could about these ruthless drug lords. Unfortunately, even though my dad was wearing a bulletproof vest and helmet at the time, a stray bullet released by Rascal, one of the drug lords, ricocheted and randomly hit his femoral artery in the leg with a high-velocity, high-caliber weapon that can cause an amazing amount of damage. If a weapon like that was to hit your liver, it would just explode like a watermelon. In my father's case, it created a small hole going into his leg and a massive hole on the exit. And despite the meticulous attempts of the police officers to make a tourniquet to stop the excessive bleeding, there was so much blood that it pooled everywhere into rivers of red all over the floor, and the smell of iron was discernible in the air and could even be tasted on the tongue. It was an appalling scene that looked like a bloodbath, and before long my dad slipped into unconsciousness and then was announced dead, and tragically died before the EMTs had a chance to escort him to hospital in an ambulance. I was to learn that the police raided the drug dealer's home at the crack of dawn to ensure everyone was in the house, and succeeded in arresting all the dealers, but one dealer, an insidiously evil man known to the officers as Rascal, was actually hiding out in a secret panel in the closet, and he tried to escape the scene by unleashing a barrage of bullets on the surprised police officers in order to escape. Naturally, he was killed instantly and on the spot, and it was discovered that he was high on drugs at the time, so he was delusional about his abilities to overcome over a dozen members of a SWAT team, which is what elevated levels of drugs can do to your reasoning. If Rascal had reacted with common sense, he would have remained in that secret panel without being arrested, and my dad would still be alive today. However, when it comes to police raids, despite the efficiency of the very brave, courageous SWAT team, none of these incidents of arrest that involve taking down some of America's most hard-lined criminals comes without perilous personal risk. My father was fully aware of the ominous dangers of his job, and even told my mother once that he was pretty certain he would die in the line of duty. If it meant taking down some of these ghastly thugs and making America a better and safer place to live, then so be it. Such was his faithfulness and loyalty to the American flag. I assure you, all these men are many of our silent, fallen American heroes. As you can imagine, losing my father at such a young, tender age, as a young boy, was my biggest nightmare and was a real travesty to me personally. He was my invincible hero as a young boy, and I always looked on him with awe because at 10 years old, I most certainly put my dad on a pedestal, as you invariably do when you're young. As I said, I was about 10 when I lost my dad, and my sister Heidi was 7, so for her I do not believe she really comprehended what had really happened. My mother sat on the sofa and told us that Daddy had gone to heaven and was singing with angels, which I remember thinking was very strange because my dad was an atrocious singer, and then she added that he was sitting on a white cloud playing a harp. I remember being very perplexed that my dad would play a harp on a cloud. He was such an unmusical person that had little to no interest in live music whatsoever. I was so worried that he might be getting bored up there, sitting on a fluffy cloud all day, playing a harp, and I would literally go out into the yard and wave up at the sky to try and alleviate his boredom. I was wondering which cloud my dad was floating on, and I would say, "Hi, Dad, I love you. I do hope you're not too bored." My mother was about the most laid-back, bohemian, chilled-out person you could ever hope to meet. In New York, she'd actually taught yoga to pregnant mothers, and she was always meditating, stretching, and drinking strange vegetable juices that she whizzed up in the food processor every single day into all kinds of nasty, muddy concoctions. I remember wondering why she would drink such putrid-looking green, sludgy drinks, especially when she would say, "Now that was a hell of a nasty." Every day she would wear her blonde hair in a ponytail and would dress in pink leggings with casual stringy loose tops that were almost always pink, which she would wear with glitzy gold sandals and bright pink lipstick. My mother decided to move to southern Colorado because she believed the fresh mountain air would heal our hearts and rejuvenate our demoralized spirits, and so it was for that very reason that she purchased this illustrious wooden cabin for the three of us. I remember the first time we drove through those very smart, highly decorative wrought iron gates down the gravel pathway towards our brand new home, that my eyes were as round as saucers and my jaw dropped to the ground. Could this palatial-looking log cabin really be ours, I wondered in awe. The front yard was lined with pretty rocks that ended up in a fire pit, which overlooked a pretty meadow, and in the distance there was a pond that twinkled like a sparkling jewel in the noonday sun. It was flanked by pine trees that were a haven for the indigenous wildlife, such as elk, mule deer, and even black bears. The panoramic views over the statuesque mountains rose up into the azure blue sky like spectacular pyramids, were majestic and imposing, not to mention the vast areas of dreamy pine trees that filled the air with spicy smells of Christmas that reminded me of white snow, mistletoe, mincemeat pies, eggnog, and sizzling Christmas turkey. You would enter the cabin through an embossed front door with etched glass into an open-plan living space where the kitchen and living areas seamlessly flowed into each other without any partitions. The walls were wooden with tongue-and-groove vaulted ceilings, and there were hardwood floors softened by Persian rugs and large, comfy, dapper-looking white sofas that were dotted with bright, cheerful cushions in oranges, reds, and burgundies. If that wasn't enough, there was a massive central stone fireplace, which was quite spectacular, with an opulent-looking white marble mantel. The wooden log staircase spiralled upstairs to all the bedrooms onto the second and third stories. There were large windows throughout that took advantage of the panoramic mountainous views of this sumptuous abode, which allowed the cabin to feel light and airy. There were floor-to-ceiling seamless glass sliding doors that opened out onto a deck that overlooked the dreamy forest. Fast forward a few weeks, and my sister and I had settled into our beautiful abode and began to enjoy our new rather solitary lifestyle, getting up close and personal to the natural world and learning so much as a result. It was a far cry from our lives in the bustling, vibrant and sometimes noisy city of New York. For a young kid it was a whole new adventure, and before long my sister and I were playing out of doors and exploring the woods on our property. We would play tag and hide and seek, and I would experiment with my sling gun. The woods were just so serene and tranquil, and I loved the exhilarating pine aroma that infused the air. Also the squirrels that bounded up the trees and the rabbits that scampered in the burrows always intrigued me. One day I was to discover that there was a vagrant camping out on our woods by the stream that zigzagged through the valley. My sister and I spied on him as he made his fire and boiled water on his fire pit. He seemed to be fully kitted out with all his camping equipment and appeared to enjoy his off-the-grid lifestyle, and was even washing his clothes at the stream and hanging them to dry on some low branches, and he was chopping firewood using our timber. He was a strange-looking man in his 70s with a shiny bald head and a scattering of grey hair that framed the edges of his scalp. I noticed that he was very emaciated, with a shriveled-up body that looked like a wizened old tortoise, and the skin on his face was sagging, wrinkled and weathered by time, with deep scowl lines clearly embedded in his skin, and his deep-set eyes were hard and cold. I told my carefree mother about the vagrant in the woods, and she was nonchalant about it and said, "Poor man, leave him alone. He's only trying to survive." It would seem she didn't care about the stranger on our property, nor did she worry about who he actually was. Supposing he was an escaped convict or a serial killer loitering around in the woods, my father would have reacted very differently given his line of work, and would almost certainly have turfed out and evacuated the strange man from our premises. But my mother was different. It's hard to describe my mother to you, but she was the kind of person that was naively ignorant and oblivious to the darker side of this world, one that my father knew only too well, but never really shared with her. I think he was very attracted to her whimsical naivety and found it so refreshing and endearing. He didn't want to contaminate it by letting her in on some of the harrowing challenges he faced on a daily basis at the police station. He liked her being so naive, I think. It pleased him that she was just so innocent and fresh. My mother believed only the best of people, to the point that even her own friends were sometimes concerned by her astonishing ignorance. My mother was homeschooling us, and she was giving people personal yoga lessons in our home, yet I could tell a deep sadness hung over her life, like a looming dark thundercloud, as I know she never came to terms with my father's tragic death, and I suppose she was quite distracted by her thoughts of and memories of him, especially in those early days of her grief. I would see her sitting on the couch with eyes pink from crying as she flicked through the photographs of my dad, remembering him with so much love. Every night at our home, my sister and I would play in the front yard and listen to the noise of crickets and frogs, but there were other noises we would hear that sounded rather like a man yelling or grunting, along with very peculiar whooping sounds that would leave us wondering what on earth that was. One day when my sister and I were spying on the vagrant in our woods, we actually saw him killing a feral cat with the back of a timber stick, which he proceeded to skin. Luckily it ended so quickly for the cat, but my sister and I were so mortified and traumatized by what we saw that we went to tell my mother what we had observed. But she was so convinced that the man had killed a squirrel and told us to stop spying on him, and that if he was living off the land, he clearly needed to eat. Little did I realize that this would be the last time I would ever lay my eyes on this very strange, peculiar man. It must have been about 2 days later when my sister and I entered the woods, and to our astonishment the vagrant's tent had been shredded to pieces and was lying scattered all over the forest like long strings of spaghetti, and all his pots and pans had been flung haphazardly around the woods. But as for the vagrant, he was absolutely nowhere to be seen, but had seemingly vanished into thin air, and my sister and I were very perturbed about what had happened to the man. All of a sudden, we heard the strange grunting sound that we often heard at night, but I could tell that the sound was coming from very close by. So I beckoned to my sister to creep ever forwards, to follow me, and to remain incredibly still, because my escalating curiosity meant I wanted to see what was making that peculiar noise. Then we saw him as we took cover behind a large pine tree, but what he was, I couldn't imagine. You would have been forgiven for believing the creature was a bear based on his huge size, but he was bigger than a bear and larger than a grizzly. He was covered in bright orange hair like the colour of orangutan. His powerful muscular back was turned away from us, and he was squatting on the ground on 2 powerful legs. I indicated for my sister to turn around quickly and tiptoe away. Whatever this thing was, it was so scary and terrifying, I wanted to get away as fast as we could. But all of a sudden it turned around, and when it did so, I was so terrified. I just froze to the spot and could feel warm liquid running down my pants, and I discovered to my horror that I'd wet myself. I desperately wanted to run away, but I could not. It would seem like my legs were superglued to the ground like solid cement, and I was frozen to the spot like a statue of ice. My sister just silently stood there, next to me with eyes as round as saucers. I could sense that she was terribly disturbed, but the crippling terror had hijacked her ability to move a muscle. It appeared that she was incapacitated as much as I was. To my horror, this Herculean-sized creature glided towards us, and those seconds seemed to last a lifetime. Was he going to murder us, I wondered? When he was standing 2 feet away from us, he looked down at us from about 8 feet off the ground, as he was exceedingly tall and easily as wide as a door, and must have weighed between 600 to 700 pounds. I just remember being gobsmacked by how gargantuan he was, because he was bigger than a grizzly bear, but lean and very ripped, with muscular definition that was exceedingly impressive. He possessed overlong arms that were so long that he could have literally touched his ankles without even bothering to bend over. What I think was the most astonishing physical aspect to this critter was the size of those shoulders, because I have never seen anything like them before. They were elephantine in size, and made his hips almost appear narrow by contrast. The critter's head was shaped like the top part of an arch that flowed seamlessly into the shoulders without any evidence of a neck. He looked human, but also reminded me of a great ape at the same time, but his face was exceedingly human-like, with a pinky grey-coloured skin that was leathery and wrinkled, with a brow ridge, flat nose, and very slender mouth. For a moment the critter looked down at us with a pair of twinkling yellow-brown eyes, and the expression on his face looked almost amused. Suddenly I heard the very clear, audible words in my head that said, "I'm not going to hurt you. Why would I do that?" Suddenly I felt convinced that this was indeed true, and it was as if the sunshine had melted the icy statue of my body, and I was able to move again. But instead of running away, my fear was overtaken by an extreme curiosity and intrigue. I just stood there staring at the animal in awe. The critter moved away from where I was standing and reached towards a furry animal that was hanging on a tree. He began to eat the insides of what looked like a squirrel and offered some to me. I shook my head, and the critter seemed to understand. He continued to squat on the ground, and my sister and I watched him eat, and all the while he watched us, and I promise you it felt like he was looking into the depths of our soul, as if he was reading our energy. He pointed to my sister and I, and then began to draw on the ground. He pointed to himself, and then drew a couple more figures in the ground. I sensed he was telling us that he had two sisters, because he pointed to my sister, and then to himself, and drew two pictures of creatures like himself, and his drawings were so good and easy to discern. He then did a picture of his whole family, and from what I gathered, there were 5 of them. He pointed to the Saint-Jean National Forest, which I think is where his family was from. My sister and I began to relax in the creature's presence, because he seemed so friendly and amenable, and before long he was making us laugh with some of his facial expressions. My little sister liked him so much and became so comfortable with him that she began to play with his long hair and braided it in her hands into tiny plaits, which was something she always did with her dolls. The critter did not appear to mind and seemed to rather enjoy the fuss, and before long, I kid you not, he was covered in tiny braids all over his body. It looked like he was covered in dreadlocks. My sister kept saying, "I'm going to make you look very pretty, just like my dolls at home." Suddenly I saw the figure of the vagrant lying dead across a single tree branch, and his head had been twisted in such a gruesome, macabre way that it was facing the wrong way round, and I knew at once that he had killed this man. The critter looked at me as if he understood what I was thinking, and then he pointed to the man that was lying dead on the tree branch, and the words, bad man, very, very bad man," flooded through my mind. I knew then that this critter was not a murderous villain, but a hero much like my dad, who dealt with evil people with little or no mercy at times. Suddenly we heard these strange owl calls that I could tell were indeed not ours. The creature pointed to the pictures he had drawn on the forest floor, and then he glided away. I remember my sister and I were so sad he'd gone, because we warmed to him so much, even though he was very scary to look at. The only way that I can describe it to you is when you discover the aggressive dog next door is actually really rather nice. Then you forget that he seemed dangerous in the first place. It felt like that. When we got home, my sister was first to tell my mother that the nice friendly bear had killed the horrible man in the woods, and she told my mother that the bear was very, very nice indeed. My mother asked if this was true, and I just told her that the vagrant was lying there dead, but I did not say anything to her about bears. I didn't want to tell her about the critter we had seen, for reasons I cannot even articulate or comprehend myself. My mother said, "Poor man, he probably died of a heart attack alone in the woods." My mother phoned the police, and imagine our amazement when we discovered that the vagrant who'd been camping in our woods was a wanted criminal responsible for killing 3 women. They falsely believed that he had been killed by a bear, but I knew differently, and I never said a word. I never wanted to tell on my hairy friend. Even if I had told the truth, I doubt they would have believed a 10-year-old boy's crazy, seemingly fictitious story. My mother was told she was lucky to be alive because this man indiscriminately killed women, and I think my mother was appalled that she had allowed us to play in the woods with that evil thug around, and realised that she could also have potentially become a victim herself. All these years later, I emphatically believe the creature we encountered was a Bigfoot, and although we never got to see him again, there were a couple of times in our childhood when we found drawings in the sand from him, so we knew he had left them there for us. I now firmly believe that Bigfoots have extrasensory perception and that they're also telepathic, because that Bigfoot spoke to my mind with audible words that I could hear. And that Bigfoot knew that that evil vagrant was dangerous and could potentially have harmed us, and for that I'm truly grateful. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.